Good morning. Good morning. Okay. Okay. If you say it a third time, it actually works. I don't know why that is, but it's true. We're here to consider several bills. Let me tell you what the game plan is. Chair's got to excuse himself at 10:30 for a meeting across the street. The vice chair will take over the meeting at that time. We're going to go ahead and take Senate Bill 104 first, and then we'll move to H.R. 340, and then we'll do Senate Bill 154, which you remember from yesterday is Senator Kirk was kind enough to allow the committee to use his 154 as a vehicle to strip out and to continue our consideration of what is still currently House Bill 32 by Representatives Chandler and Turner. And then we'll move to SB 1. You have, or you should have in your folder, a very revised substitute of SB 1 that comes from the author, and it comes as a result of conversations that we've had very collaboratively over the last several days. By the time we get to that, the vice chair will be presiding. We'll go through that as with any bill. If we're, and this is again by just to let you know about the communication that we've had, our plan is to work through this revised substitute of SB 1 to the extent that we can naturally get to a motion on that, fine. If we can't, then we'll continue it with the intent of taking a motion tomorrow at our regular afternoon meeting. And this will likely, although not definitely, but likely be the only bill that we would have on that calendar at our regular meeting, which will I would hope to be our final meeting tomorrow afternoon. So having laid that out, Senator James, welcome. And Senator James is here on Senate Bill 104.
Excuse me. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I am bringing forth, I appreciate you hearing Senate Bill 104, because you know that over the past 8 years, the Georgia General Assembly has been making really great strides in addressing the crime of human trafficking. And with the passage of House Bill 141 in 2013 legislative session, the governor supported legislation and the First Lady to form a joint human trafficking commission. And that was formed by 141, which was sponsored by Representative Ed Lindsey and Senator Renee Utterman. And it became effective September 15, 2013. The posting of National Human Trafficking Center hotlines were offered on the federal level and accepted by the Joint Committee, and has been distributed in the state of Georgia since then. However, this bill would only allow them to have an opportunity to be in our government agencies as well, and a link would go on our websites of all our government agencies. This passed unanimously in all of the committees of the Senate, including on the floor of the Senate. It passed unanimously. It does not adversely affect any other human trafficking bill. In fact, this enhances it because it lifts the sunset on this hotline, that number that I've passed out smaller versions of it because it's in Spanish and English. And these are the large signs that go into many of the other buildings, so I do have the actual signs that go in. But right now, they have been distributed in businesses, in the airports, in entertainment places, in grocery stores, bathrooms, in different places. And the businesses now already volunteer to do it. And I've gone on about maybe 7 Saturdays going out with big groups who support this, and we never have any businesses to turn us down. And we put out, really, literally, I put out hundreds. and it's something that would only help the young people who have been lured by evil predators to be trafficked on the streets. It will only give them an opportunity to get a number and get help. And so this is all this bill will do. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer it. It is supported by Senator Utterman. In fact, she put a friendly amendment on the bill when it came on the floor of the Senate. And Mr. Chairman, may I also add one other thing?
Yes, ma'am.
When we had a conference in Savannah last year, the DFACS director and 2 other directors of departments actually asked me about it, and because we were passing out the materials, and they said that this would be they're the ones that actually suggested that we put them in government agencies. And so this is another reason why I immediately wrote the legislation and brought it forward.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Questions from members of the committee? Ms. Quick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Senator, for the bill.
Yes.
I just wanted to make sure that I was reading it correctly. I know that there's been some discussion about the extension of the notice requirement to government buildings and the necessity for it, and obviously the policy reasons for making the notice more readily available to the public. But my question is about lines 131 and 132. In addition to that policy change, this bill would also eliminate the sunset on the original legislation that we passed in 2013, correct?
Correct.
And
because now it's 2019 that it would sunset.
And so we're eliminating that sunset early, earlier than you would normally discuss eliminating a sunset in something like this, I guess, or at least that's been my limited experience. When we passed this in 2013, there was some discussion about the cost to private businesses, and the list of private businesses is somewhat extensive in this. Has that been resolved to everyone's satisfaction? Do you have any information about that?
Yes, now the private businesses volunteer to put it in. They don't have to put it in. Once they volunteer and sign something, then they're saying they'll continue to put them in, and it's no cost to them. This is printed by the federal government, and it's given out by the federal government. So it's by the federal hotline. So it's no cost at all to any of the businesses. And then if they choose not to do it, then they are not required to do it. It's only if they volunteer and sign something.
Thank you, ma'am.
You're welcome.
Mr. Sessler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Do you know how many phone calls we've gotten in Georgia since this was instituted back in 2013?
No, but I've heard from so many different people that it's not working. However, I had an opportunity to go up to Virginia and see the hotlines off the chain all day long, and they have just a room full of people answering the phone. So this is nothing I took lightly. I did go and do my homework, and I do know that it is working very well. And the thing that might help even here in Georgia is that the friendly amendment that was put on adds another number for Georgia. So it adds the number that I think was on the legislation that already came before you by one of the representatives. I can't remember the number, 140, I think. A human trafficking bill that just passed out of our, is that yours? Yes. Okay. So no, it does, it only adds that number that you wanted to add also. So it gives 2 ways, but it's already, once it's called in, it's linked to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, and it goes to Georgia already, but it will also go to that number as well now, and so whichever one responds. But yes, we do, it is not true that we're not getting a lot of calls.
Mr. Reeves, did you have some?
I did, just for Chairman Setzler. I can't remember what the exact starting number is, but from my work on this issue, the number of calls, it's a nationwide number, but they obviously track it where they receive the calls state by state. And the number of calls from Georgia has actually almost doubled each year in a compounding fashion. So it is proving to be a successful program, and that it's certainly growing. So.
And sir, can I thank you very much for your hard work on this issue. It's very important. Thank you.
Any further questions for the author? Dr. Price.
Just to be clear, I wasn't here when the original law was passed, but all we're doing here is adding government buildings. Is that
Yes,
correct?
that's all is being done, and is that it will require government entities to post these human trafficking hotline models, and also offer a hyperlink on their websites.
Right. So
And-
basically, we're
Increase.
asking government to do the same thing we're asking the rest of the world to do.
Yes.
Thank you.
And Representative Willard, who is very passionate about this issue, has agreed to carry this legislation if you pass it.
Thank you. I see no further questions. This bill did not go through subcommittee, so let me ask, is there anyone in the audience here who would like to be heard against Senate Bill 104? Is there anyone here who would like to be heard against Senate Bill 104? In opposition to? Seeing none, what's the pleasure of the committee? Mr. Bodie moves do pass. I think a second by Ms. Kendrick of Senate Bill 104, SB 104/FA. Are there any amendments? Seeing none, any further discussion? Seeing none, all in favor of the gentleman's motion, signify by saying aye. Opposed? The ayes have it. The motion is adopted. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Yes, ma'am. Let's move directly to H.R. 340. Representative Clark.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I have before you today H.R. 340. It's a urging resolution dealing with medicinal marijuana. Just asking, well, it goes through and it kind of lays out, and first of all, I want to thank Chairman Setzler for his help on me getting this through his subcommittee and taking what I did originally was pretty broad and narrowing it down to be strictly dealing with medicinal marijuana purposes. So it lays out the case of what states have done, including Georgia, including the District of Columbia, in passing medicinal marijuana laws. Then it lays out what Georgia has done with HB 1 in 2015, and then even all the way dating back to 1980, the General Assembly has acknowledged the medicinal uses of marijuana for certain ailments and diseases. And it also lays out what the U.S. Congress is doing in practice on lines 23 through 30, what they're doing in practice and not prosecuting these the states that have passed medicinal marijuana laws. And then it lays it out, and then it asks that that we urge Congress of the United States to amend the Controlled Substance Act of 1970 so as to reduce marijuana as a Schedule I controlled substance. So the idea would be to make it fall under just like any other prescription drug, that it would be regulated as such, and not going beyond that to recreational purposes, just allowing for the medicinal value that even the FDA acknowledges in owning a patent on some uses. And so it also asks that the clerk will transmit to our federal delegation if it passes. And that's the resolution, Mr. Chairman.
A report of the subcommittee chair, Mr. Sessler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This being just a House resolution, handled a little bit differently with Representative Clark. He did present it twice. There wasn't really testimony on it. I told him he needed to dramatically narrow it from where it started. It contemplated it was talking about growing, it was talking about all kinds of things. And Mr. Chairman, listening to the gentleman's intent, he wanted sort of an up or down vote on the proposition of rescheduling medical marijuana. Again, let me separate my subcommittee chair role with my personal beliefs as a member. I don't support this policy, but I do think the gentleman he asked for an up or down vote on the underlying policy that I think he's achieved in this resolution as it's drafted. I think it's a fair policy question for this committee. He's gone through 2 revisions, and I told him if we could get to a place that I felt like was sufficiently narrowed to be a up or down policy question, it made sense, Mr. Chairman, to be heard by the full committee. That's where we are today. So it's, again, this is the goal, I think, of the gentleman is to take the existing efforts that we've enacted as a General Assembly to look at low THC oil and the potential of medical marijuana to be rescheduled for purposes of not having this tortured system where we have banks that can't take money from entities that produce low THC oil, the whole weird system we're living in, this level double life. That's what the gentleman's seeking to address. Again, I don't support his underlying policy, but his efforts have been to try to narrow this down to be considered by the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Sessler. Just a quick question, and urging resolutions are just that. They're
Correct.
urging resolutions. Sort of the whereas, we call it the whereases. You can call it the preamble. We call it the whereases. That's not a technical term, but it ultimately distills down to in my mind, and this is an eye of the beholder determination, but in my opinion, which may or may not be shared by others, it really distills down to lines 31 to 34 in terms of what the actual urge is, and urging the Congress of the United States to amend the Controlled Substances Act. On line 33, is reduce the right word?
That I asked the same question to Legislative Council, and they said that was consistent with.
Okay. Is that what you've seen before, Ms. Travis? Oh, okay. Oh, right. I mean, I just assumed it would be rescheduled, but I don't know if that's really the proper term of art or not. Well, maybe not. It could schedule 1 to schedule X.
So you're asking to change the word reduce to reschedule?
No, I'm just asking the question about, is that the proper terminology at all? Does the GBI have any, Nellie, do you have any perspective? If not, you're not on the spot, don't worry. Okay. It's not earth-shattering one way or the other, probably. Dr. Price.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for bringing this. I agree that I think the word reduce needs to be replaced by reschedule or some other appropriate word. That's jumped out at me as well. Reclassify, that's it. I was just curious if you're aware of any, if the author's aware of any medical trials that have been done elsewhere or anywhere that show the efficacy of THC in any conditions.
It is very difficult for people to do research and development because it is a Schedule I drug, and therefore it's hard. I believe there was a program at one point set up by the federal government in Mississippi, and through that, study, I believe, the FDA actually took a patent. And see, part of it is the FDA, in order for it to schedule a drug as Schedule 1, one of the 3 criteria is it cannot have any medicinal value. Yet the same FDA that schedules it as a Schedule 1 drug owns a patent on a medicinal use of marijuana. So it's kind of contradictory there in some level. So, and I would have to look up that patent number. I don't have it off the top of my head, but so they have acknowledged, the FDA has even acknowledged some medicinal use. And again, I don't want it to go widespread and people using it. And here's where I'm at with this, and I've told people this before. My heart on this issue is when you're dealing with this substance, you can do 3 things with it. One, people can abuse it and receive it and be licentious with it. 2, because people are licentious with it and abuse it, you can reject it outright and just make it completely illegal. Or 3, and where I hope we get to, is we can redeem it. What I think was originally meant to be good, you can have it be a substance that serves a purpose to help benefit people that need medical help. So that's my heart with this resolution. I'm not trying to tell Congress to set forth an exact policy with this and do what has to be for them to do what they need to do. Anything specifically, just trying to urge them to change it so that we can do the research and development that I think is necessary to see how it can be beneficial and what can be done with it. So, and I know some other members on the committee have spent a lot more time in this area. They might be able to answer that question too if there's been any research and development.
If I may. Sure. Yeah, I'm not aware of any studies that show efficacy of marijuana in any of the conditions that we have approved it for in Georgia. On the other hand, there have been some trials, I'm not even sure they're in this country, that show it effective, possibly limited fashion in one condition, that's spasticity. So I personally have been, very appalled at the hijacking of the House of Medicine in support of essentially legalizing recreational use of marijuana. That being said, I fully support your resolution because I think the only way to make any progress is to do studies. So I'm in support of it, but I'm not in support of our current Georgia law or anything that's coming down the pike. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Grebley.
Mr. Chairman, just to answer the first question, United States Patent 6630507 is the patent that the United States holds for the cannabinoids as antioxidants and neuroprotectants. In order for the United States to seek a patent or at least receive a patent, there has to be a medical opinion written, if I'm correct. Or, that would suffice to think that they would otherwise not want to hold a patent on this particular substance. Also, my understanding is that the Institute of, Mr. Chairman, if there's anybody in the room, what would be the highest medical association in the United States? The American Medical Association? Or the Institute of Health and...
Government or non-governmental? Yeah, public or private?
Both.
HHS, I think we know people there now.
Well, exactly. I guess my question, that would I guess be my question is, who would write an opinion for the United States government to hold a patent on a medical substance? I guess would be my question. Oh no, and that's not what I said. I said that who would write a patent that the United States would seek to own on a medical or what they would consider medical. The second question would be if there are any studies. Israel, matter of fact, which is using our patent, Israel has done medical studies, Crohn's disease, cancer, Alzheimer's, dementia, even some studies on the prevention of methadone addiction. And I don't want to contradict, I was just answering some of the questions that were asked. But that's something I would like to find out, because I've always had that question is, first, why did the United States seek a patent on this? Second, who wrote the opinion that the United States used for the patent is my question. But I think in order for us to further understand, maybe we find out that it's completely dangerous. Maybe we find out that all the laws we've been working on are not good laws at all, but maybe we find out the contrary, and that is that there are a litany of medical uses for this particular substance. And I think that's the importance of having the rescheduling, is that we don't want to put anyone's medical license, we don't want to put any university's accreditation or possible federal funding opportunities in jeopardy, simply so that we can get this and study it to find out the efficacy of it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any further questions for the author? Seeing none, what's the pleasure of the committee? Mr. Gravely moves due pass of H.R. 340, LC 372429S. Are there any amendments, Mr. Setzler?
Sure, I do have an amendment, and I would say, before I offer it, I would say this as a cautionary note. This is just where I stand as a member of the committee. And I know, having spoken to Representative Clark, I know your motives are pure on this. My concern is there are not big pushes to find valid medicinal uses of parsley, broccoli, other green substances. It almost seems as if, I'm just saying this is my approach to this, Mr. Chairman, it almost seems as if there's a tortured effort to find some meaningful medicinal use somewhere, some way for marijuana, because if we can find some legitimizing use, then it becomes the crowbar to open it up for which is really the underlying purpose, which is recreational use. I haven't seen I haven't seen resolutions that have come to find medicinal uses and studies for the other herbs in my kitchen, because there's not a known, in the minds of the would-be recreational user, delicious outcome to them if we can just find one legitimate use for it. So I say as a cautionary, I will offer an amendment, Mr. Chairman, but I say as a cautionary point, and this is just my stance as a member of this committee, I think it is bad policy to indulge what I believe is fueled by a recreational desire for marijuana, to find one or two legitimate maybe uses medically that then could be the pretextual justification for blowing a door wide open for what is otherwise a recreational animus. So with that, I'll offer an amendment that clarifies the gentleman's words, perhaps, but I share that as members, my concern to members of the committee. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to offer an amendment to strike the word reduce on lines 33, strike the word reduce, and strike the word as, and in place of the word reduce, insert the word reclassify, and instead of the word as, insert the words from being. Now, subject to council's greater wisdom, it would read, so as to reclassify marijuana from being a Schedule I controlled substance so that its medical benefits and effects may be further researched. So as to reclassify marijuana from being a Schedule I controlled substance. That's how it would read. Against a technical amendment to help the gentleman with his goal. Again,
Let me just ask counsel, I don't know that from being adds any additional value just from what it was before as. Is that what would you think about that?
Okay.
Just to simplify, how about, so,
Ms. Travis, do you have any suggestions? I'm fishing here.
reclassify. So as to reclassify. Yeah, just, what about, how about just striking reduce and inserting reclassify? So as to reclassify marijuana as a Schedule I.
To reclassify, it seems that you're saying reclassify into being a controlled substance. It's, yeah. I
I see.
I put from being, because you would seem to need to have a verb in there, but. The, Right, again, so the amendment would say reclassify marijuana from being a Schedule I controlled substance. I mean, Schedule I is, the schedule is inherent in the classification. I don't know that our congressmen will parse our words better than we could when they receive this, so.
Do we even need to go ahead and mention Schedule 1, because it is a Schedule 1, simply to reclassify it? Because it already is Schedule 1, we maybe need not even mention that, because it is what it is.
So moved, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Let's read, council, can you read that back, just to make sure we're clear? Any objection to the amendment? Any objection to the amendment? If not, it's adopted. Any further amendments? Seeing none, any further discussion? Seeing none, on the underlying motion of do pass by substitute of HR 340, all in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed?
No.
The ayes have it, and the motion is adopted.
Thank you, committee. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Representative. We'll call SB 154/HB 32. Do we? Let me just make sure. Representatives Chandler and Turner, thank you for your continuing hard work on this very difficult issue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and members of the committee.
Let me just ask one
Sure.
point, clarifying point. Members, we have two substitutes. I want to make sure that we're looking at the one that you're working off of first. So if you could give us the LC that you're looking at, so we can make sure we're looking at it.
We are looking at LC 297597S.
7597S.
Yes.
7597S is what the authors are working from. Representative Chandler, if I have to get up and roll, the vice chair will take my seat.
Thank you. And again, we're looking at sexual offenses in our schools. I'm sure you've been hearing on the radio another case where a parapro cannot be prosecuted because present law only allows for teachers, principals, and other administrators to be prosecuted for sexual offenses against students. All we're doing here, if you will look on line 18, we are striking out teacher, principal, etc., assistant principal, and other administrator, and saying, again, under supervisory or disciplinary authority, this person is an employee or an agent of any school and engages in sexual contact with such other individual who the actor knew or should have known is enrolled in the same school. And this is in the same code section dealing with hospitals, law enforcement, and one other area, I can't remember what it is.
A psychotherapist, prison inmates.
But anyway, it's in that same code section, and we'll be glad to try to answer any questions, or Representative Turner, if you want to add anything.
To summarize, we have the threshold, the overarching qualifier of someone who has supervisory or disciplinary authority over another individual.
That is correct.
That gets them into sexual assault. It's not just in a teacher, principal, assistant principal or administrator. It's any employee or agent of the school who has supervisory or disciplinary authority over the student. That gets, that's what gets them into the net. And it also provides for that individual upon conviction to be on the sex offender registry. Is that a correct statement?
That's a correct statement.
Okay.
And just for the edification of the committee, this, starting at line 12, is where we're addressing changes in the code, but just above that, it's not listed here, but is current law and is unchanged, is this language: a person who has supervisory or disciplinary authority over another individual commits sexual assault when that person, and then it would read, is a...
So we're consistent.
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly.
Ms. Silcox.
Yes, I thank y'all for bringing this bill, and I'm just curious. I'm concerned because I know a lot of the schools in this day and time consistently are hiring a lot more community coaches, and so is it your intent? I would think it would be that your intent would be that an agent would also be covered by this language. A community coach would be an agent.
So if they are employed or an agent, and they have the key thing here is if they have the ability to disciplinary authority or supervisory authority over that student,
okay,
then they would be caught up in this particular.
And I was just curious, from an insurance standpoint, would an errors and omissions policy, would this be covered by an errors and omissions policy? Does anybody know the answer to that? Just curious. It's just.
I haven't been asked that question before.
Okay. Just curious. That would be an additional insurance cost for the schools.
Maybe one of the attorneys who practice in that area on the committee might have something to.
Well, that's, read your policy.
That would be up to the school.
Call your county commissioner.
Yes.
Read your policy.
Yeah. That's a good lawyerly advice right there from the chairman.
It is what it is, and
yeah.
that's a big part of liability. That's a big part of pricing. Those are potentially big ticket items in liability. So that's a great question. Mr. Reeves.
Thank you. I know there's been we've gone round and round on this a lot, and there's been a wide range of positions on this that have been fueled with a lot of different thought processes and opinions and passion. But I have young kids, and my expectation is that when my children go to school, I don't want to have to worry about anybody at that school being able to take advantage of them that way without being subject to what I think is an appropriate criminal offense. And I know that not everybody. Anyways, I feel very strongly about that. And so to segue that, when we say employer agent, is there any position at a school that wouldn't fall under employer agent? And if this was asked before and I zoned out, I apologize, but is there any person who would have a regular, now I know there's PTA volunteers and things like that, and parents and whatnot, but is there any person that would have a regular position at the school that would not be subject to this?
So to answer your question, short and brief, yes, there would be scenarios where somebody would fall into the category of not being an employer agent. However, what I want to point out is what we're dealing with are people who have supervisory authority over the kids. So your substitute teacher, your parapros, those are the folks that are going to get caught up in this. I was asked this question yesterday, and immediately the example that came to my mind was somebody who works the landscaping. They're an employee of the school district, but they don't have disciplinary authority over the children. That person wouldn't be caught up in this because they don't have the ability to enforce school rules. They don't have supervisory authority.
Okay.
And the same representative could be said of a custodial worker.
It depends on if the school hasn't given that individual the
So that'd be
authority to enforce school
A
rules.
district by district matter,
It
right?
depends on if they do have the ability to enforce school rules, and this is going to apply to them.
Okay.
Is it fair to say that I was about to ask the question about everybody has the ability to enforce school rules. That doesn't necessarily mean that they have supervisory or disciplinary authority, and that's your dividing line.
Yes.
Right.
That is the dividing line that has been established by the General Assembly. We are simply expanding it to make sure that we capture everybody that actually does have
Which
that.
is unlike the previous substitute that this committee considered and approved, where it cast a much wider net
Correct.
That's correct.
because of the ability to enforce school rules.
Correct.
And this is a fallback from that position. Is that a fair statement?
I believe
And
it
it
is
reflects a
fair statement.
consistency with the existing code that
Exactly.
maybe we didn't have in the previous substitute. Is that fair?
I think that's a
That
fair
is
statement.
correct.
Okay. Mr. Setzler?
Mr. Chairman, you just captured it. That was this has been discussed extensively in our subcommittee, and this is the intent of what the lady and the gentleman started out with in this session. I shared my concerns. I think this is a nuanced issue that I think this committee would do well to take a multi-tiered approach to. But this is the gentleman and the lady's intent. So it's a policy question. It's not the bill I would draw, and that's known, but I do think this is what you set out to do. And I think this substitute, again, for members of this committee, relative to what this committee acted on, with some amendments that emerged in a previous full committee meeting, that did create some unintended consequences. This is what the lady and the gentleman started with. I would say to everybody, just for purposes of clarity, lines 12 through 14 clarifies that we're talking about public and private schools. There was I believe, a real mess in the existing law that could have implicated a piano teacher, a dance coach outside of a school setting. I mean, any educational environment could have been wide open, and that's not something that a student is required to go to. There's no duty to be there. There's not the same in loco parentis status there. It was a really nebulous and I think potentially chaotic definition. This is very clear. This is what you started out trying to do. You're talking about schools, public schools and private schools. So to that, I think this at least gives us clarity. Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Representative Bodie.
Thank you all for making the changes. It looks like lines, and Chairman Reeves might have alluded to this early, lines 50 through 54.
We don't have that.
You don't have that?
No.
That's
Are you on the right?
substitute
79,
79.
7579.
I'm sorry.
The 7597.
I'll
Sorry.
say that for Senator Kirk. Is that Senator Kirk's portion of the bill?
No.
No.
That will be deleted.
A
and-
previous substitute,
Okay.
Yeah.
maybe.
All right, just so that everybody is 100% clear, we are working on LC 297597S.
Sorry, I misspoke there.
I withdraw my question.
Number 18, is that Representative Price?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I'm just trying to line things up with the current law and the numbers. And 16 through 21 look fine, but I'm not sure 12 through 15 where that fits exactly.
Well, school, and I've got the whole code section pulled up on my computer here, so I'm doing the same thing. I'm looking at it. Subsection A is the definitions, and
Right.
school is the last, number 5, school is the last definition in that subsection. And then it proceeds straight into B in current law, so I think that I had to look at the full statute to understand the same thing, so.
I have it here on
Okay.
my.
Close.
Okay, so that 5 is related to B, not A.
It's
Okay.
A5,
Right.
it's a definition, that's right.
So that goes somewhere totally different, which,
See, this goes in subsection A.
so we never had A here at all.
No,
This is only
Sure.
B.
no.
Okay.
This is A.
All right, thank you.
Chairman Setzler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was going to say to the point of the author and to members of the committee, if you track the way employer agent works, employer agent is used throughout this code section, really, and it's intended to be broad, but it's limited by the condition of supervisory or disciplinary responsibility. So rather than, the way that the law was crafted before, I think there was a mistake. There was thinking, we're just limiting it to teacher, principal, assistant principal. What this does, again, as a matter of policy, is it broadens it to any potential person in the school setting, could be a community coach, but it's got to satisfy that element of supervisory or disciplinary responsibility. So if there were a community coach, hypothetically, that was a volunteer that's working with a football team and had no influence on a spring sport athlete, female athlete on the cross-country team, it might not be possible to demonstrate that because they're an agent of the school in the fall for football, that they have supervisory responsibility over a spring sports student in the spring. And I think a jury finders of fact would look at that and say, you know what, he's an agent of the school, but we don't believe that represents supervisory responsibility, and that element still has to be satisfied. And I think that's the limiting factor in this. Like, the question is, what this does do is it limits it to, it expands the pool of potential people that could be considered, but then holds it subject to that supervisory disciplinary element. That's the way this works. I think the way it was drawn before is that the pool of people, even that had supervisory responsibility, was narrowed to a limited enumerated set. So there could be people who had legitimate disciplinary authority over students who, by enumerating those, were excluded from this. And that's why these parapers are getting away with it. So I think that was the gentleman, the lady's intent. So that's just for clarity.
Thank you. Is it Representative Trammell?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've shared this, as several have said, we've been round and round about this and the inclusion of the word agent. And I just want to share with the committee my concern and ask for comment from the sponsors. As I understand the law, the question will each time be individually a jury question as to whether or not an agent had supervisory or disciplinary authority in the context of criminal action. And my question is, who are we trying to capture with the word agent that isn't already encompassed in the word employee?
For the first part of this is to make it consistent with existing code and every other code section. If you read the code section that we are dealing with here today, I'll read from some of the other areas that is in current code. I'm going to skip from B down to 2. So it'll say a person who has supervisory or disciplinary authority over another individual commits sexual assault when that person is an employee or agent of any probation or parole officer. And then it goes down to 3, is an employee or agent of a law enforcement agency. Number 4, is an employee or agent of a hospital. Number 5, is an employee or agent of a correctional facility. Our goal, part of this goal is to maintain the consistency with every other code section, because we think that's a good policy. The second part of your question is, who are we trying to catch here? We're trying to make sure that we are not limiting the hands of a prosecutor that if a subcontractor should be on campus for whatever reason, a substitute teacher, that wouldn't necessarily fit the definition under today's code, would be subject to the law. And so when the goal is to capture anybody that has the ability to bend the will of the victim to gain sexual advantage over them. And that's the goal. So anybody that fits that category is who we're trying to capture in this language.
Mr. Chairman, I would just, and again, this is just a point that we hashed out in subcommittee, and just a part for difference, but the inclusion of the word agent opens up the possibility that we catch into this net people that we're not intending to catch at the moment, or that are qualitatively different. And this subjects them to automatic registration on the sex offender registry. They are ineligible for first offender treatment. And so that's the policy decision we're making. And as one member of the committee, I would try to draw that line more tightly.
So just to address it, the goal of my goal, I'll speak for myself, is that similar to what Chairman Reeves had said a moment ago, when you send your child onto a campus, you have an expectation as a parent that they're going to be safe, they're going to be protected from inappropriate behavior. The goal of this legislation has always been to protect that student from somebody that has authority over them to bend their will. And whether it's an agent or whether it is an employee is inconsequential to that. If they have supervisory authority over a student, they can use that authority in ways to bend the will of that student, to make them think that they're engaging in a consensual relationship when they're not. And so that is why I think it's important that that is included, and it is important that we address that as a policy statewide.
I hear what you're saying, and I understand, but again, remember, it's that supervisory or disciplinary authority, and there are not going to be a lot of those. I can think of, for example, some school systems will have a resource officer who is not an employee of the school, but that person does have supervisory or disciplinary authority over students. But there would be others that would not, such as subcontractors.
And when we were in subcommittee, I just want to point out too, one of the things I think that we've kind of had an aha moment that has kind of changed the perspective on this, and that is the language that would precede line 12 in this bill. In our first subcommittee hearing, when we only had a handful of the members that were here and we were discussing it, that was kind of brushed aside as inconsequential, but it is absolutely meaningful to this piece of legislation. And so every conversation after that language that dealt with supervisory or disciplinary authority, every subsequent conversation that we had after that was tainted by that conclusion that was incorrect, that didn't matter, but it absolutely does matter. So when we had the question about whether or not we were going to add the word agent, it was tainted by that incorrect conclusion that language prior to this code section that we are addressing today had no impact on it. It absolutely does. It absolutely matters, because what we're talking about are people who have the authority over other people.
Okay, Chairman Setzler, did you want to add something?
Just one clarification. I know we want to wrap this up, Mr. Chairman. I would say this to answer your question on the agent. You know, you can imagine a parent chaperone on say the kids are taking a week-long trip to Washington, D.C. You know, a parent chaperone looking after kids. You kind of, you could have a circumstance where parents are given responsibility to look after kids in a hotel for 4 nights in D.C. That's an agent, not an employee. Now, would that parent classify as supervisory responsibility in a back-and-home setting? No, I don't think so, and I don't think the jury would find that. But if it were, and I certainly hope a jury would not find that a parent would be over some other student in a back-home setting, would be found as having supervisory responsibility. But in the context of a week-long trip to Washington, D.C., they might. To your point, I will share just as a member of the committee, I think this issue is best handled if we've tiered this. I think agents should be treated differently. I think the level of refinement would be better addressed with a tiered approach. But the gentleman's and the lady's approach is to take this, and I think, although I might find a better way to do it, is this a better way than the current status quo? That's what we're challenged with. So I'm not so much arguing for their bill. I've told them very clearly I think there ought to be a multi-tiered, more finesse approach to this, and I think I share your concern. But to be clear, some big brother or a parent or an uncle that's going on a trip to Washington, D.C. as an adult chaperone with formal responsibility from the school is an agent in the school, and it is different in nature if they had a sexual relationship with a kid in a hotel room on a Washington, D.C. trip than if it were something back at home in a different setting where they don't have that supervisory responsibility. So for clarity, I think agent, community coach. If it's a community coach that has a male community coach over a girls' volleyball team with supervisory responsibility on trips over a group of girls in a high school, that's an agent, not an employee. But it is, they do have control over those kids versus that probably has more of an impact than the status of what their role is on campus. I would argue a teacher in another part of campus or that's in a satellite of the school that never sees a kid might have less direct supervisory responsibility than a community coach that has daily contact, oversight, and control on trips. I think the gentleman's approach, just for clarity, is let the finders of fact on the jury establish if the supervisory or disciplinary elements exist or not. Should we as a legislature limit that to a narrow subset of jobs, or should it really be up to the jury? That's the question, Mr. Chairman, I think, and I would just leave it at that.
Number 17. Oh, no. Sorry, Representative Kendrick. Been waiting patiently.
Hey, thank you, Mr. Chair. I do support, what you're trying to do with the bill, but I share the same concerns as Chairman Setzler and Representative Trammell, in that the word agency is very, very broad, and I haven't taken a look at the rest of the code to see how it's used, but the word agency, you can have actual agency, implied agency, apparent agency. There's so many different ways to have agency legally. I'm worried that it's going to capture people and punish them, to Chairman Setzler's point, at a level that should be very different than the word employee. So I'm having trouble with the word agency as well, is very, very broad. And there's lots of ways to get caught up in the word agency.
Could you give me an example of your concern?
Well, I mean, I think Chairman Setzler gave a good example of the child that would go to an overnight trip to D.C. for 1 week, in that they could be considered an agent, but are they maybe an implied agent? Maybe you don't have a written documentation saying that they are an agent, but it's implied because of the circumstances. Or maybe somebody, a parent meets them in Washington, D.C., and obviously they didn't sign up for the trip at first, but now they're on the trip. That's a parent agency. There's different ways to come under the umbrella of agency. And so I guess that's my concern, is that it's not the same level of intensity as it would as if you were under the legal definition of employee.
So I just want to make sure I understand, in using the, now I'm just going to wave on that. I just wanted to get clarified. Thank you for that. And I would just point again that the narrow definition of agent is somebody that has disciplinary or supervisory authority over the students. So if the parent that is on an overnight trip, and I'm going to use Savannah instead of DC to keep it in state bounds and clarify the example. If somebody goes on a weekend trip, field trip with the class, and they are acting as an agent, and they have authority over students, and that parent chaperone engages in a sexual relationship on that trip with a student, I believe that they absolutely should be caught up in this particular code section, because they are using their authority to gain sexual advantage over the child.
Sure.
So a follow-up question. So you're saying that the definition of agent, you're redefining the definition, sort of the common law definition of agent?
I'm not redefining it. I'm pointing to current code, which we pointed out earlier. Just want to make sure that I'll read it to you to make sure that we're talking about the same thing. Right before it's line 16. It's in the bill. A person who has supervisory or disciplinary authority over another individual commits sexual assault when that such person is.
Okay,
that modifies agent and narrows it to somebody that has that authority over them. So I hope that would address the lady's concerns.
All right, Representative Strickland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So in my mind, the whole idea of an agent is someone that's temporarily acting as an employee. So I don't understand the difference. I think whether you are supervising or disciplining children, using that authority for 5 minutes or for 5 years, under this code section, if you use that authority that you have to then engage in a sexual relationship with a child, I don't see the difference. I just think it's one the same. That's the whole reason we have agency law in our code. And you hit the nail on the head. The issue really is lines 16 to 17. That's where it's consistent.
That's
so
right.
If you're playing that role, if you're a contractor, if you're an employee, no matter who you are, if you're playing that role, at that point you get caught up in this. And I think that is consistent with what your intention is. That's just my opinion on it.
That is correct.
And I think
Thank you,
that
Chairman.
it's important to note, if I may, that a person who, the term disciplinary authority, that's going to be yet another question for the jury, to determine. I try to think of all of this in being in a trial, being a prosecutor, being a defense attorney, and whether or not that person has disciplinary authority is going to be a question for the jury to decide. And so I think that while a lot of the conversation is we're talking about the term agent, I think to me, the focus of this is in the question of, which would be a jury question, of supervisor or disciplinary authority. I'm going to wrap us up with Representative Quick, and then I think hopefully entertain a motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to give a little bipartisan backup to Representative Trammell on this question because I think it's a fair one. And I'm just going to disagree with you, Representative Turner, about that this subject that we're discussing is similar to these other situations which are clear custodial arrangements because of all of the different individuals that people in public and private school settings come in contact with in a variety of settings. And so part of the issue, just for clarity, for those maybe listening at home or in the audience who've not been a part of this discussion, we're not talking about child molestation. We're talking about conduct, criminalizing conduct, which but for this statute would not otherwise be a crime of this nature. And so we're talking about a status offense, which is why everyone who's talking about words are talking about words, because word matters, and our job here is not to simply cast a net over folks and let the jury sort it out. Our job is to try to thread a needle and capture the conduct in situations that we are looking at where people need to be protected because of the status. And so part of the issue, which we discussed previously, is the way that the Supreme Court has defined supervision in this setting. And Representative Turner keeps talking about these other scenarios and pointing us back to supervisory or disciplinary authority. And the court in State versus Morrow defined it quite differently in this context, stating there was at least some evidence from which a rational jury might properly have inferred that Morrow had an occasional and limited power to direct other students and to enforce compliance with school rules. That could go to get out of the hall or get to your room in this context, and again, creating a status offense. So just for clarity, I think that's why people are so concerned, and we're not really struggling with something that's irrelevant. We're struggling about casting a net over folks that has some serious consequences in a criminal prosecution. And Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to come back to where we started this discussion in subcommittee and why we have struggled with it so mightily.
May I
Sure.
ask a question? So are you saying that the word agent is what bothers you?
Yes, ma'am. That's absolutely, I think, what bothers folks in this scenario.
I completely appreciate your point of view, Representative Quick, and I know you and I have had a lot of conversations about this, and I completely understand your point of view. I would disagree with the premise that if not but for this statute, it would be completely legal, because when you look at all of what we're trying to do in this code section, the entire code section, not when I want to clarify when I say what we are trying to do is what the code is today. When you have a relationship between two people where one person has authority over another, it has been the policy of the legislature that would be illegal. And I'll give you an example that is ripped right from the headlines regarding a probation officer and a probationer, where just a couple weeks ago we had a probation officer brought up on charges for engaging in a consensual sexual relationship with a probationer. That is the policy of the General Assembly has been for many years now, that is off limits. That when somebody uses that authority, even though that probation officer and that probationer may be in love, they may have a consensual relationship, and if they were not in that type of arrangement where one was a probation officer and the other was a probationer, that would be a legal relationship. We have defined this as a policy of the General Assembly over the years that this is, when you have authority over someone else, that is out of bounds. And so while I respect and understand your point of view, I simply disagree.
And so would the gentleman from Cherokee then just define sexual contact in this context that then might catch up an assistant coach
Well, sexual contact is
in a consensual sexual relationship, a young man of a young age?
it's defined here as sexual conduct means any conduct between the actor and a person not married to the actor involving the intimate parts of either person for the purpose of sexual gratification of the actor.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, could we hear from,
We have got, I mean,
okay.
who did you want to hear from?
I wanted to know if we could hear from the DA, somebody from the DA or organization about the word agent here.
If they really quickly have something to inject,
I believe everybody here has debated that agent issue completely, and the question is whether or not you want to leave agent in there, because there's a legitimate argument about why agent is different in this portion of the code section than the rest of the code section. Really, I believe that that's the whole issue is over agent, whether or not you're going to leave that in the bill. I submit passing the law and taking the word agent out improves the law.
And we would too, if we would entertain an amendment.
Okay, well, there's no more discussion, so at this time, is there a motion? Is there a second? Okay, there's a motion and a second. Are there any amendments? Representative Trammell.
Mr. Chairman, with respect to the authors, I think this is a policy question that the committee needs to weigh in on. So I would offer an amendment at line 18 to strike the words "or agent."
Okay, there is a motion by Representative Trammell to strike the words "or agent" at the end of line 18. All those in favor of the passage of the Trammell amendment, please state aye. Aye. All opposed? No. Okay, the ayes have it. So are there any further amendments? Okay, seeing none, we have a motion to pass LC 297597S as amended. All those in favor of the passage of this bill state aye. Aye. All opposed? No. Okay, the ayes clearly have it. So, okay, we are thank you. Thank you, representatives.
Thank you all. It's just been quite the experience. Appreciate you.
Your diligence and perseverance.
Mr. Majority Leader, are you ready to? If you and Mr. Easton want to take the table, what I am going to do. And by the way, just so everyone, in case I was up all night with food sickness last night, food poisoning last night, and so I'd had a very rough night. And so if I appear out of it today, I am absolutely out of it today. I'm hanging on by a thread here. So if I seem slow, there's a reason that's slower than normal. But what we're going to do, Mr. Leader, is what I would like for you to do is walk us through the sub. Mr. Spahas has a hard deadline. He's got to walk out of here at 11:20. So what I would like to do is at 11:10, give him, knowing that he has to leave, is give him the opportunity. Is 10 minutes? Okay. So at 11:10, I'm going to allow him to give his commentary, and then we'll continue on if you are still kind of walking us through the substitute, and then we will have discussion from the committee. So at your pleasure.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, I'm glad to be back with you with SB 1. It's the Senate's efforts to address domestic terrorism in the state of Georgia now and in the future. You'll notice that your substitute is now a 7-page bill when I started with a 34-page bill in front of you, so it is greatly pared down. The concerns raised by every single member of the subcommittee have been addressed in trying to make something satisfactory to you. I'm sure Mr. Spahos will be doing the happy dance here in a little bit because he wins the turf war with the AG. And the GBI will be likely doing their happy dance because they retain control of the command of the Fusion Center rather than the Homeland Security Commissioner having that. I'll walk through the bill. It will be relatively quickly. Most of you have heard two presentations on this, so it'll be fewer things. But this is one bill that the little prologue, you know, from lines 1 to 15 actually very accurately reflect what's being done in the bill, and I'm going to kind of walk you through it. The first thing we had looked at was the criminal statute for domestic terrorism. And one of the great concerns of the Senate Republican caucus, for sure, was that it was so outdated that it was dealing only with attacks or attempts to kill 10 or more people. It didn't address sort of less large attacks, we would say, you know, smaller targeted areas. It didn't address, you know, seriously injuring people and not killing them. It didn't address damage to our critical infrastructure of the state or attacks, you know, the power grid, those type of things we've talked about. It was also designed originally as a sort of a sentence enhancer type bill to require the maximum punishment for people that engaged in that type of activity and didn't have separate criminal penalties set out for the activity. I think I mentioned to you in the first meeting that I thought that would be a more appropriate way, and I was open to perfection of the bill to do that, and this new bill does it. So the first thing we do is we essentially strike the current domestic terrorism statute, which is a penalty enhancer type bill. And we replace that beginning on line 30 of page 2 with a new statute that deals with domestic terrorism. The first stage here would be the critical, you know, just the definitions, lists critical infrastructure and goes on to define domestic terrorism, et cetera, and runs through largely what we had before. You will note on page 3, starting at line 58, where we do set out penalties for the various criminal acts as separate crimes under this criminal statute. It will be a new section, Title 16-11-221, and that is under the section of crimes and offenses against the public welfare and sort of society as a whole. Joe, I see you watching me. If I get off bounds anywhere, I appreciate your help in the draftsmanship and making this comport to the current Georgia code. Feel free to correct me. I will take no offense whatsoever to that. At line 61, we talk about actions that result in death, and the penalty for that would be the death penalty, life without parole, or life in prison. Down at line 63, if the offense was kidnapping, we listed it 15 to 35 years. Again, at line 65, any offense with serious bodily harm, 15 to 35 years. And at line 67, you know, the attack on the critical infrastructure to destroy or disable that would be 15 to 25 years. I have added the line 70, which was in the original version, that these are mandatory sentences. You will not suspend, stay, probate, defer, et cetera, the sentence. They are mandatory sentences within that sentencing range. And at line 72, that these, if they're in addition to other predicate acts, they would be consecutive sentences, not run concurrently or at the same time, to show that we're serious. I think I've been over this pretty thoroughly, so I don't want to belabor the points on that, but I think this is a really good substitute that very precisely defines what we're talking about. You will recall that Senator Lester Jackson, who is the chairman of the Black Legislative Caucus, supports this bill. He helped amend it in the Senate. He approves of this. He can't be here today, but he's testified previously before you. I think he also had the president of Black Lives Matter. They are very comfortable with this bill, that it does not infringe on any civil rights or right to protest, free speech, et cetera. So I wanted to point that out because there was some inaccurate news reporting after I guess it was the first meeting we had. You guys heard two bills that day. One was, I think we were calling it the badge bill over in the Senate, but it was protecting law enforcement, and it did deal with blocking an interstate highway or transportation system, and there was opposition to that. This bill does not include just interfering with the transportation systems. You have to destroy or disable critical infrastructure to be an offense under this, and it is my opinion that it has broad bipartisan support, and none of those type of objections apply. And just as a final note, on page 4, line 90, was a provision added by the minority party in the Senate that said it shall not apply to constitutionally protected speech or lawful assemblies, just to make it doubly clear that this would not be a crime to exercise your constitutional rights in those regards. While we're on that page 4 at the very top, I had extensive language that gave new authority for the Attorney General to prosecute this crime, and it gave, I had a hybrid system where the Attorney General would have had exclusive jurisdiction to prosecute multi-jurisdictional cases. The district attorneys would have their existing jurisdiction within their districts to prosecute. This makes it, you'll just see there's at line 87 to 88, I took about 3 pages of the previous bill and we condensed it to 2 lines, that the Attorney General will have authority to prosecute domestic terrorism. That is new power we are granting to him, but that power will be concurrent with the local district attorneys. That is a compromise to appease that constituency. Going on down page 4, we have added, in this I think Mr. Spahos may have some language for us today. I'm hopeful he has more defined language, but we realize...
And I'm sorry, which line?
I'm now on page 4 at line 93 in that section.
Do you have a copy of that?
I do not have the amendment.
Can somebody see if we can...
While they're bringing that, it was pointed out to us by the Prosecuting Attorney's Council that there had been a ricin attack, I think it was in the Speaker's district, and that this code, our current code, did not address that poison, which is, I don't think it has any other useful, this at all, other than a toxin to kill people. And we referenced this convention, a international convention that included that definition, and I think this new amendment more specifically specifies what we're talking about, but that's what we're getting at, is using bacteriological weapons. This is a different criminal offense. It is not included in this new domestic terrorism. It is existing code 16780 using bacteriological or biological weapons, and it amends that to specifically include ricin as one of those toxins that would be covered by that. And the same thing going down further down the page, starting at line 106, we include bacteriological weapons or biological weapons, again, in an existing criminal code that has a separate crime for dealing with those type of explosives, et cetera. Now, I don't know everybody by name, but Representative Boddy, I think you had some specific questions for me about the subpoena power and the issuance of warrants, and did they adequately protect the rights of the accused or the person that was being requested, to produce information, et cetera. What we had done was taken the language from the sex trafficking code, which gave broad investigatory powers to the Attorney General, and merged that in this code section. I have cleaned that up for you, and I think it will address your concerns. As it turns out, there is an existing code in Georgia, Title 16-9-108 and 109, which give these type of investigatory powers to both the Attorney General and district attorneys. So if you can turn to page 5, up there beginning at line 118, I'm capturing that language that is already in the code for other criminal offenses. And we are adding, if you look at line 123, Code Section 16-11-221. That is this new domestic terrorism statute that we're creating here, the new crime. So it adds to the existing subject matters that can already be investigated by DAs and the Attorney General, and includes domestic terrorism. That first section from lines 119 to 130 deal with the subpoenaing of documents or testimony of witnesses, requiring depositions or whatnot. And that allows the Attorney General or the District Attorney to issue a subpoena to compel a witness's testimony or these type of documents. It is not included here, but there is the right to object to that. If you would go to the original code there, 16.9-108, you will see the way that operates. But essentially, it's what we discussed the other day, is that if you refuse to give up the documents or whatever's been subpoenaed from you of tangible nature, then you don't have to go file a motion to quash. You just don't give it up. And the prosecutor then has to go to Superior Court in your jurisdiction and ask for an order to compel you to do it. And at that point, you have your right to be heard, your due process rights. Now, going down at line 131 through 147 deals more with requesting documents from service providers of electronic communications, et cetera, or electronically stored data. And here you will be more relieved, I think, because that does require a search warrant to obtain that information. So you couldn't just issue a subpoena to get somebody's phone records or Facebook records or those type of things that are electronically stored. So you have that, probable cause standard. You'd have to, articulable suspicion, et cetera, you would have to go get a warrant to obtain that information. And there I suspect that, or I'm sure that the service provider, whoever, if they were, having it sought, would have their opportunity to be heard. At least there's judicial review there before that would issue. So that was my attempt to satisfy your concerns in this regard. So I hope that's done it, because we're not making up some new rights. We're simply adding a new criminal offense to the way it's currently handled in these other type of investigations. That keeps us consistent with the law. Going down that page at line 149, we have also amended another criminal statute on terroristic threats, which is a current violation of Georgia law. And we include threatening essentially these elements of domestic terrorism as a terroristic threat as well. So that adds it to that criminal code section to make sure that that would capture these types of actions that we're making a separate crime as well. So this makes threatening this type of domestic terrorism a crime, just like the underlying statute will make committing those acts standards. To page 7, remember we talked about initially the statute was a penalty enhancer. At the top here, lines 186 through 190, it lists these type of actions of domestic terror that result in death, murder, as an aggravated circumstance for the death penalty. If in order to impose a death penalty, there's a list of aggravating circumstances. This would be the 12th such circumstance. If the murder was committed during an act of domestic terrorism, that would be taken into account by the finder of fact or in the sentencing phase of a death penalty case. It would give grounds for the death penalty if it's not otherwise present, which it more than likely would be in these type of actions. All right, so we've dealt with the new modernized offense of domestic terrorism, who's going to prosecute it, and we've talked about some of these tweaks on existing statutes in the penalty phase. If you recall, one of the other sort of motivations for this legislation was to make sure that local law enforcement is reporting suspicious activity, terrorist type activity, to the Fusion Center. As I described, our collaborative effort between federal law enforcement and state law enforcement in the Fusion Center GSAC. We want to make sure that local law enforcement passes along the information so it can be analyzed and reviewed and reacted to. There was language in my original version that dealt with, and it came, I think you pointed out, came from the CFR. Some of it, the terror watch list, who is a known terrorist or a suspected terrorist. I've removed that, and we decided the best way to go about this is to make sure that in our law enforcement training in Georgia, that all law enforcement is trained in how to identify and report activity that may lead to domestic terrorism. I'm reading from line 200. To combat domestic terrorism and it's essentially teaching these people to report to GSAC any suspicious activity. So that is what it's softer than a mandate saying you must, as local law enforcement, report a suspected terrorist. Now we're going to train these folks how to observe and report suspicious terrorist type activities so that that data can be analyzed by GSAC. So what was left out, largely other than these very significant refinements to appease your concerns that were expressed in the 2 committee meetings we've already had, is the creation of a Department of Homeland Security. And there was controversy in giving command and control over our existing GSAC Fusion Center to this new Director of Homeland Security. Now, it's really false to say this is new because we have a Director or a Commissioner of Homeland Security, and that is the same individual that's in charge of GEMA. And last year we combined those 2 agencies. So there was some pushback from the House that we are expanding government or creating some new agency. I want you to realize we already have a Commissioner of Homeland Security, and we already have the agency dealing with it. It's GEMSA. GEMA and Homeland Security were combined last year, so we have done that in code. What I was attempting to do is to break it out and have a more defined, specific role for Homeland Security. I still think that's good public policy. I am losing the energy for the fight this late in the session. Sometimes you live to fight another day or promote your ideas later. The disappointing part about this to me is that that was the original focus of this legislation. We've got a Director of Homeland Security, we've got GEMA, but what we don't have is a coordinated strategy to fight domestic terror. And if you went back to the original bill lines, starting at line 213, you don't have to do it right now, but basically, pages 7 through 13 set out the duties of the Commissioner of Homeland Security, created the board that had 17 people on a board of Homeland Security, and then tasked that commissioner and that board with coming up with a strategy for our state how to combat.
Mr. Spadehouse, were you going to the podium? Okay. I think it's
well,
12 after.
This is a good spot for me
Okay.
To stop. So I would implore you to consider that as this legislation goes through the process, taking out the command and control of GSAC. But we still ought to create a Board of Homeland Security. We already have the commissioner. We ought to give him defined roles and duties, and we ought to require the development of an anti-terrorist strategy, which I don't believe we are currently doing, and I hope we will do that either further along the legislative process here or certainly in follow-up legislation next year. I recognize some of these big issues are multi-year projects. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Spadehouse.
Thank you. Look, let me start out by thanking Senator Cowsert and Mr. Eason for sitting down with all involved and looking at this and coming up in what, in my opinion and our opinion, is a sound approach to the topics that this bill is covering. A couple of things that I'll point out just for consideration and commit that these are not, we're not opposed to what we're doing here. We're just suggesting some things to think about. On line 36, with our new definition of domestic terrorism, I know there's been some discussion amongst committee members about whether or not this concept should apply to any act that violates state law, or should it apply when it's a felony act that applies to state law. Some concern was that there could be some misdemeanors that do include, some of the intent elements that are below that turns into a misdemeanor violation, and is that the kind of behavior we're trying to capture? I just submit that's an issue that needs to be
discussed. This definition for the first time uses the line, starting at line 38, is intended to advance further or effectuate an ideology. That language was in a previous version. Just, I submit to you the way it is inserted here, that's now an element at any time we're going to use this. So if you were to make it about felonies and you wanted to make it unlawful acts that were felonies or series of acts by a group that intends to disable or destroy critical infrastructure, state government, fish, that kind of thing, and all of these other elements are present, then that element of proving the ideology may be an issue. So I make you aware of that. I think at line 41, results in major economic loss is also a good qualifier that should relay some of the, or prevent some of the concerns that were discussed about how major or minor this event would be before this punishment kicks in. Let me take you over to line 68. There was some discussion about the doing the damage to the critical infrastructure. The words disable or destroyed are there. There was some conversation about what about damages in between that don't result in complete destruction but could be significant, so I bring that to your attention to consider. Starting at line 75, we had raised earlier the issue of venue. This new code section does a great job of dealing with that. I'll move on to the section 3.1. You have before you an amendment that we've worked with legislative counsel, and she worked well into the night trying to get that done. What that does is it captures two concepts. It is the list of chemicals that have been compiled for some time by the U.S. government and other governments that have agreed on a certain list of chemicals we all agree are just chemical or weapon in nature and there's no legitimate use for, and they literally schedule them as Schedule 1. So it lists those chemicals that, instead of this site, lists that. And then we grabbed 18 U.S.C. 178 for three other definitions of chemicals so that we're not here like we do with a drug update every year. Every time they come up with a new way to kill a bunch of people, we have to add it to the list. So this is the way the federal government has done it. It's about certain chemicals and the nature of the chemicals, where they come from, and how they're used. So that's what that amendment does. I agree with the senator in that section 3.3 and 3.4 are the way we're already doing business. There's safeguards in there. We all understand how that worked, and this is a great way to deal with that. 3.5, there was also some discussion yesterday about the way we originally came to amending terroristic threats is we did not have anywhere else in the code to do it, because this code section originally is over in the concepts of theories of crimes. Because we've created a new code section, or a new article dealing with this, perhaps we could do a additional paragraph within that article about the threat to commit one of these acts, as opposed to trying to tie it into this. And don't get me wrong, we helped create this at the time because of the nature of where we were working in two different codes. But because we're in an article, perhaps we could help draft a threat to commit one of these acts with the same elements, and probably require a substantial step towards committing one of these acts. So combine the concepts of the theory of criminal attempt with a threat within this article probably solves what you're trying to get at about a threat. And I hated to do that, but I'm scheduled to go with the chairman to participate in a panel at 11:30. So I'll take any questions of that, and also submit we'll be back in an hour and a half, and be glad to participate in any conversations with offline about this.
Any questions for Mr. Spahas? Okay, number 15.
That's me, Mr. Chairman. Just one question. I don't remember if I saw this in the original bill, but at line 41, it says basically destruction that results in a major economic loss. The major economic loss would be a factor. I don't remember if that was in the original or not, but is there a definition for major economic loss anywhere?
Not that I'm aware of. I think this was an attempt to narrow this down some. I don't know. We haven't spent a lot of time discussing that element.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, any other questions for Mr. Spahas? Okay, what, okay.
Thank you so much, Mr. Fayaz, for your same concern that you have in lines 36 through 42. And it says as part of a single unlawful act or series of unlawful acts. If we're going to say not including misdemeanors, do we kind of embrace or we encompass where we're not trying to bring in misdemeanor offenses that can be kind of categorized in the same type of effort? Do you think we can achieve that by putting that language? Well, your concern is what?
I would commit to working with legislative council about the appropriate place, but perhaps we just qualify the laws of this state that the violation thereof constitutes a felony, something of that nature. There's a way to work that in there.
Representative Price, did you have a question? for Mr.
Just
Spahouse?
a simple question, thank you. On line 67 through 69, talking about public transportation systems being disabled or destroyed. Does that include functionally disabled, i.e. if an assembly of people, and I'm not sure whether it would be lawful or unlawful, just blocks the traverse of, say, a bus or what have you?
Yes, and under the proposal I'm making, they would have to be committing a felony for it to apply to them. So if it's just misdemeanor blocking the road or something of that nature, you wouldn't invoke this. That's part of why we're at least suggesting for the committee to consider qualifying. You've got to be committing a felony before you even get to this structure. So if they're committing a felony and they violate, and under my proposal, and you violate and you block a bus, then yes, this could apply. If you are committing misdemeanors, then no.
Thank you.
Chairman Setzler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate your, Mr. Spahouse, on line 36. You know, any felony I think that's a strong narrowing, and I say that because members of the public, they hear, oh, we're talking about domestic terrorism, and the circular reasoning you see when you talk to people. We could talk about trying to parse this, and they look at me, well, yeah, but we're talking about terrorists, right? Well, but we're defining what that means, and I think
We're trying to make it about terrorists.
I think in people's mind's eye when they talk about they think about terrorists, that they're not talking about rowdy public dissent. Let me ask you this question, Mr. Spahouse, on line 38 through 39. Perhaps it's directed to the author, but intended to advance further or effectuate an ideology. I know that's a limiting element. I'm just concerned when we put that in there, why would malice, just pure criminal malice, not be equally as troubling? I mean, I've got this person here that's motivated by hate and just wants to see people be hurt. And I have someone else over here that's motivated by an ideology that may be, an ideology. I don't know why ideology is something we want, even though it has the effect of limiting the sum. I don't know why people that are not just malicious haters that are doing the exact same things wouldn't be seen as terrorists. I'm just concerned that the way this colors our law in general when we link it to an ideology. I know it has the effect of limiting this, but I think it also colors it in a way where we're saying, well, he's just a hater that blew up bridges and did these things just to see pain. But these people over here did it because they're advancing an ideology and a belief system. Therefore, they're going to get treated this more stringent way. To me, I think I don't know that I want to hold people that have a governing ideology to a different standard than somebody who's just a pure hater that has malice, is creating big malicious crimes. So I'm concerned by advance further or effectuate an ideology, even though it has the effect of limiting it. I'm concerned it colors the bill in a way that's very troubling to me. I say that as a member. One other question for the gentleman is I guess likewise on line 90, constitutionally protected speech or lawful assemblies. If we're going to put that in there, I don't know why we wouldn't say constitutionally protected speech or assemblies. I mean, the First Amendment doesn't give us a right to lawful assembly. It gives us a right to assembly. No, in this day of free speech zones, where a governmental agency gets to decide, or the Board of Regents gets to decide that, Mr. Setzler, this 40 by 40 place in our student center. That's your free speech zone. Go speak there. That's not what's I mean, I'm not lecturing you guys. I'm just, that's very concerning to me. If we're going to talk about a constitutionally protected right, it's a right to speech, right to assembly. The lawful almost is circular reasoning there. And that's something we brought up before. It's not the first time you've heard that from a senator, but I raised that as a concern.
You want me to respond to those two
Yes,
before
sir.
you
Please.
get too
Please.
many on your checklist? That's why the word constitutionally was used.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a term of art. Well, you have those rights as defined in the Constitution and by courts' interpretations of them. So rather than use the word lawful or peaceful or something that might be less than what's protected in the Constitution or more than, we use that term constitutionally. I'm not a brilliant wordsmither, but you could take the words "not apply to" and say this article shall not be construed to infringe upon constitutionally protected speech, and you might read a little prettier, yet more accurately there. Back to
And Senator, just real briefly, I'm very friendly to the constitutionally protected piece.
Right.
I just feel like it's choked by lawful, because lawful is what a General Assembly or what an executive agency determines on that day.
okay.
We're going to deem this lawful. My concern was lawful.
Well, then you can take out the word lawful. If it's constitutionally protected assembly, then that's fine. And to your other point about the ideological drive there, this was the Democratic amendment. Okay, but both of the things you're attacking are supported by the minority party, and they felt like it gave them more protection to show that this was aimed at what our, maybe it's a politically incorrect terminology or whatever, but is these type of actions that are to advance an ideology by intimidating the population, damage to infrastructure, serious injury, etc. But you could simply at line 39 take out the words advance further or effectuate an ideology, and it'd be fine. It would be easier for the prosecutors to prosecute more actions by doing that, which is what caused concern to Black Lives Matter people that were saying, wait a second, you're trying to suppress our rights of protest. So that was the two things you found were included in one of the same amendments by Senator Jackson. I'm okay either way. I think you can get to where you're trying to go to stop this type of activity without being as specific if you have heartburn there.
Well, Mr. Lute, I think my concerns are consistent with theirs. Probably that we have a tradition of civil, nonviolent resistance. That I mean, I was reading. You can read Dr. King's letters from the Birmingham Jail. He talks about where is it important to violate the law. It's an exegesis on when is law breaking moral, and I think it's a.
And that's what we're saying. I mean, it's also an American way to, democracy to protest and demonstrate whatever, but it is not the American way to do it through violent means of seriously injuring people, killing people, and damaging the infrastructure of our country so where it hurts, painful economic loss or loss of life. So, we're just creating those boundaries that we're not going to tolerate this. If we don't draw a line somewhere, then we are devolving into chaos. I mean, it is becoming more and more frequent, and that's where we're trying to draw the line.
Thanks, sir. Mr. Chair, can I ask one further question?
Please.
On lines 122 through 130, section 3.3, page 5. I know there's been I know the gate's been opened on this in certain limited circumstances in statute. I guess I'm concerned about that underlying approach that you're giving prosecutors the authority to subpoena, but then there's also this ability to not to object to it. I'm concerned that what this does is it prejudices people who are under-informed or represented. You're in essence saying it can be subpoenaed, and if people are, I'm just walking around guy terms, right? If someone's dumb enough to give it up, they get it. But if they're well represented and they're lawyered up and they've got good counsel, they're not going to give it because they're going to object to it. I mean, that's functionally what we're saying. And I'm just concerned that well-represented, powerful entities get protection, and regular people who don't really know their rights can get can get rolled. And that's my concern with this. I mean, if it's something that I mean, I have issues with executive warrants generally, but I don't know why we're gonna proliferate something that only the well-lawyered people get protection from and others get rolled on. That's a concern of mine. I would just, maybe you'd not seen it that way.
It's a great balancing act of society. In order to protect society from criminal activity, you have to have the tools to investigate and prosecute it. And, where is that line of personal rights versus the society's rights to prosecute? Representative Trammell had a great point the other day on the immunity language. You'll notice that's gone. Thanks for your guidance there. We had a provision in that gave provisions that protected a person against self-incrimination. If they complied with this, that created some issues. Or how are you ever going to prosecute somebody if they, to get the information from them, they're immune from being prosecuted. They're the ones that you're investigating, and that became, my mind got so twisted trying to figure a way to respond to Representative Trammell's legitimate concerns there, I just took it out completely. Although that was lifted from another area of the code. So what you're pointing out here, yeah, we have done some things along the way that maybe it could have been more artful, maybe not. Maybe you need to go back next year and have a statute that amends every single one of these powers that's given. I mean, because this is the only thing changed there on the part from 121 to 130 is adding this code section. So I mean, this is not something newly created. It's already in play in all these other types of criminal investigations, and we just built it in to that. That doesn't mean what we did before is good or smart or wise or just. So if you find something sometimes when you're digging through here that's not right, have at it. It's the best way I could figure to do it. And it has been done without a lot of public hue and outcry in these areas of elder abuse, sex trafficking, identity fraud, et cetera, that it's currently being, that tactic is being used in.
Mr. Lee, forgive me for not catching these things when they slid through this committee, perhaps when I was before. I would say some things, if you look at certain things where it's inherently he said, she said, I mean, elder abuse, it's difficult to build probable cause in those cases because sometimes it's one-on-one. You've got, I mean, who's going to testify to it, right? Where do you get the evidence? I mean, there may be a subset of cases where, by the nature of the charge, establishing probable cause may be hard to do. And I can imagine those circumstances where you might crack the door a little bit, because how do you ever get probable cause? So I say that parenthetically. It's a concern we can talk through. I just wanted to raise that to you, Mr. Leader.
Thank you. I appreciate your concerns.
Mr. Trammell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator, thank you for paring down the bill. I think there's some good improvements here, but a couple of questions, and I'll just start with the last question that Representative Setzler was asking on this administrative subpoena power. Now, I share that concern about the expansion of the administrative subpoena power, which is a circumvention of the Fourth Amendment. But what I'd like to ask you is it looks like when you look up these other code sections and where the particular code section that we're trying to slide into here, 16.9.108, I mean, the majority of those deal with the use of a computer, and would just ask if what are we trying to obtain here, and whether you would be friendly to the same type of limitation that's in the language about Article 8 of the chapter involving the use of a computer in furtherance of the act.
So I guess the way to effectuate that would be to simply remove 1611.221 at line 123, so that you would not be giving the Attorney General or the DAs that subpoena power in this, but you would leave the warrant power for the electronic records in the section 3-4. That would be a policy decision for this committee to make.
Well, I certainly think removing 1611.221 works. I mean, it does change
It does
change
not
the bill.
give that power to subpoena to a DA or an AG for domestic terrorism would be the effect of just removing that. So you would limit one of the tools we have to investigate domestic terror in furtherance of individual rights against, Fourth Amendment unreasonable search and seizure. That would be a policy decision.
Right, and if I might, Mr. Chairman,
Please.
just to I guess what I'm asking is, are you trying to obtain information that isn't computer information?
Yes, under that top section, includes deposing witnesses, production of books, records, papers, and taking depositions there at line 126 and 7, whereas the section 3-4 begin at line 132 are more specific to disclosures from service providers like your phone carriers and your Facebook, Google, whoever.
Right, and with respect to that, Senator, as I understand that section in section 3-4, that's actually the warrant requirement is because that is when the Attorney General or District Attorney would actually be seeking to obtain the contents of the communication. So that necessitates the warrant in that
There's
circumstance.
a whole nother wiretap statute, as I think you may be aware.
Mr. Chairman, if I might ask just one more question on a different part of the bill, at line 32 in the bill. Can you help me with the privately owned facilities language? I just want to make sure that I understand exactly, if it's a privately owned utility, I understand.
Right.
But the way the definition is, it would seem to open it up, and the concern I have is that, we're in the situation where it's not really, the language is not limited enough, so you're just dealing with a private party. If they suffer sufficient damage, and they have political heft, then they're able to persuade that the case needs to be prosecuted under the domestic terrorism because they're a privately owned facility that provides a benefit to the public. What are we trying to get there that's not a publicly owned asset?
So much of it is, Georgia Power and the EMCs own the power grid. That's not, we hadn't nationalized it or whatever you would call in America. They're not state-owned utilities. Phone companies. We've got a plethora of different telecommunications providers. Typically public transportation is public, I can't think of, but I imagine there are private rail lines that moving the stuff from the port. So it's often a blend of our infrastructure in this country is not all state owned, and that's I kind of hearing what you're saying, but I can't figure a way to narrow that down to only publicly owned things.
And Mr. Chairman, if I might just ask one to clarify that, but if somebody did something to, let's say, Wells Fargo, okay, as I read the definition of privately owned facility, which includes financial, and it was a major economic loss, wouldn't they have standing, or wouldn't they have the ability to argue to a prosecutor that whatever happened to them,
Absolutely.
whatever crime was committed, should apply under domestic terrorism?
That's true. I can't remember the book right now, but Tom Clancy has a novel like Sum of All Fears or something where there was an attack on the New York Stock Exchange. The whole financial system collapsed, but and then y'all remember that? Then they reversed it somehow, and the next day they said, we're going to put everybody back where they started. But it's, that would be catastrophic, and it would be the type of thing to disrupt and intimidate our society. So I would hope we would capture that. I'm hearing a little bit from what you're saying about maybe a private cause of action. That person, they'd still have Representative Gravely would know there'd be a good tort of some sort there, I'm sure, for damaging their property or whatnot. But, this is to protect our society from these type of attacks that cause great economic harm or disrupt our society. I don't know if I can narrow it down more. That's...
So, Mr. Chairman, with the committee's indulgence, so if I'm a private attorney, somebody's, I represent one of these entities. So now with this language, what I do is I sue under the RICO statute and I pursue treble damages because I argue that the predicate conduct is in violation of the domestic terrorism statute. This is just another consequence of the bill.
Yeah, and a good one. Back at 9/11, I think we had lawsuits against all kind of foreign nations and whatnot that participated in that under that same type of RICO approach. But of course, this is just the criminal statute.
I'm actually, there's a couple questions, but I'm going to ask a few to try to get us to the, stopping point where we.
I'm at a stop. I'm just
sure.
I'll answer as long as you guys.
That's right, and I think that what I see happening is reconvening tomorrow and with a few changes and going from there. But can you talk to the terroristic threat section? And we talked in the time that you and I and Mr. Easton spent privately working through this bill. Obviously, there was a lot of things, and so we spent a little bit of time on this, but not as much. And I didn't personally get the clarity that that I want on this. And I know that Mr. Spouse had brought up some concerns. Couple of questions that I maybe explaining why exactly what the reason. I believe it was to the aspect of a criminal attempt or a substantial step that somebody intends to take those out. And then when I look at lines 161 and 177, we're using the term civilian population of the state or political subdivisions, which is a part of the definition of domestic terrorism earlier in the bill. And so if domestic terrorism is being included as it is in here in line 157, is it necessary to include that part of the definition? Does it become circular those are my thoughts. Can you walk us through that,
I'll be
please?
happy to. First of all, back to his comments, Spejos, about felony versus misdemeanor. The type of things this domestic terrorism statute is attacking is serious bodily injury. That's a felony. Killing people, that's a felony. And I would imagine the level of damage. I mean, we did something more than just damaging property. It's got to disable or destroy property would be criminal trespass of a felony level. What is $1,000 or something? I think is the line of demarcation between misdemeanor criminal trespass and felony criminal trespass. So I think that's all fun to say, but I think that's implicitly here. All right, back to you on the terroristic threats. You just kind of sometimes got to roll your mind back, and what we have here is existing statute except the part that's underlined. Okay, so right now, you at line 156, you commit an offense of terroristic threat when he or she threatens to commit any crime of violence, and then it goes down, release hazardous. Well, we're just wanting to make sure that that includes what we've just now defined as domestic terrorism, which can also be serious bodily injury or damage to the critical infrastructure. And then at line 161, the reason we have the civilian population of the state or any of its political subdivision is because currently a terroristic threat is made with the purpose of terrorizing another, or in other words, one other individual. And this encompasses what we're trying to say some of the acts of domestic terrorism are threats against society as a whole, so to speak, or intimidate the civilian population, not like just say, I'm going to beat your butt after school if you don't pick me on your basketball team or whatever, So that's where we're trying to, that's why we put that defining language in.
So the purpose, so you're not restating the definition, but you're clarifying that the intention is for this to be broader than one single person. And it just,
a crime of violence
by using the same language from the definition, that's what I thought was the best way to.
As we've defined domestic terrorism now, it includes destroying or disabling critical infrastructure as well as hurting an individual. That's all we're trying to do. So now to threaten domestic terrorism is just as bad as a terroristic threat to harm another person or whatever.
And I think with I'm going to call on a few more people here, but the challenge with this, as with a lot of things, and to quote your words a second ago, striking the balance. And we're talking about with Chairman Setzler and some of his concerns, and I think about from what he was saying, those that are legally equipped. I think about Miranda, right? Miranda rights. The difference between somebody who's aware of their Miranda rights and not is a night and day difference between the case. But I digress, or the evidence that they give up. But the part of striking the balance seems to be, from what I'm hearing from just sitting here, is drawing that line with the felony versus misdemeanor. And I think that you have probably covered this, and some of it is because of, I think I'm about ready to pass out on the ground because of the being sick, but what would be examples of misdemeanors that would be appropriately? I know you talked about, I think, trespass $1,000, but what would be examples of misdemeanors that you feel would be appropriate to move forward under this statute?
I cannot imagine that any misdemeanor offense would qualify for domestic terrorism.
Based on all the elements adding
So
up,
I think
right?
it'd be superfluous. to
That's
put
right. You
that
said
in
it's
there.
implicit that it. Okay, that's right.
And it doesn't hurt my feelings one bit if you put it in there
Mhm.
because it doesn't change what I think's
Sure. Okay.
included in
And
the bill.
you're right. You said that a second. I said at the beginning I was probably gonna
Wanna do
struggle
it
here
in
today.
Abundance of caution.
Mhm.
Boy, I could think a long time before I could think of any misdemeanor offense that would qualify as domestic terrorism as we've defined it in this bill.
I'm gonna call on Representative Bodie. He's been waiting patiently.
Just coming to line 190. When you discuss the word murder, I know in Georgia we have two types of murder: felony murder and malice murder. Are you going to make that distinction there, or should we put that in there where we make that distinction? Because I could see where it could go either way, and me and Representative Darshawn Kendrick has been talking about this.
Right.
Felony murder, if
You
you
pull up
acted
17, 10,
and committing a felony,
30.
somebody dies, it could be that, and malice murder is more premeditated, which probably most domestic terrorism acts are premeditated.
I would think.
So, would you be okay with us maybe making that distinction?
Why don't we look at the 171030 and Ms. Travis, does 171030 give any context as the word murder? Do you know off the top of your head? And that's I'm looking at the statute right now on my computer, and it uses frequently the word murder, rape, armed robbery, kidnapping, etc. So it doesn't. I think I'm just skimming it right now, but I don't see any differentiation between the two different types of murder. But number 15, is that
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a kind of a simple question. It's not really getting the policy. It's about the structure of the bill. Line 190 adds the commission of a murder during an act of domestic terrorism to the list of death penalty charges. But then over on line 61 and 62, I guess starting at 59, any person who commits domestic terrorism is guilty of a felony, and upon conviction shall be punished as follows. 1, if death results, then by life, by imprisonment for life. Is that inconsistent with line 190?
well, it says death. 61 says
Oh,
by death.
Okay,
So yeah,
I misread it. My mistake. Thank you.
is that right, Mr. Leader? Is that
I defer to the whip.
Yeah.
If y'all got it figured out, I'm
No,
kinda lost.
I just read it so quickly I skipped
Yeah,
a word.
I get
It was an important word. The word death.
Yeah, got it. So it would be two different, the same
Yeah.
conduct could be two different offenses. It can be murder and domestic terrorism.
Representative Silcox?
And I was just curious, thank you, Mr. Chairman, if this definition of domestic terrorism is it consistent with the federal definition? I think that's important in terms of jurisdictional
I think
type
you're right.
situations. You know, are we going to get?
I'm going to defer to my right-hand man, my executive counsel, Donovan Eason, to answer that.
I
He
just
can
wouldn't
tell
want
you
there to
where
be
that came from.
confusion as to territorial law enforcement issues.
I feel like the leader's trying to get the word executive council in front of y'all as much as possible before I get out of here. Totally unmerited. I will say that I worked with Ms. Travis on this. We drew a lot of inspiration from two federal laws specifically, and there are two that we spoke about last hearing we had in front of you guys, and that was 18 USC 2332F, and 2332B. 2331 was the definitions that were set out in a terrorism chapter within the crimes and offenses of the federal code. Some of the definitions that we drew from 2332F that dealt with like bombings and detonations of things, that's where we found the language for public transportation system, for instance. For the definition they drew up, state or government facility was drawn through there. The definition of domestic terrorism in itself, when you look at lines 43 through 47, they are substantially similar to the lines that set out the definition of domestic terrorism, those specific lines in the federal code.
Okay.
It just has a little bit of a Georgia style to it in terms of how we tend to codify things.
Okay, good. Okay.
But in terms of, the language that you see in lines 36 through 42, specifically when we say single unlawful act or unlawful acts, when we say interrelated by distinguishing characteristics, when we say advance, further, effectuate ideology, those are things that we do differently in terms of it's not just that, it's not in the federal definition of what's constituted as domestic terrorism.
Okay.
So does that clarify?
It does help.
Okay.
And then I do think we need to specify, personally, 36 to 41, as Mr. Speha said, that these are things that rise to a level of felony. It's somewhere in there. And then Whip Coomer's concern about major economic loss. Is there a damages amount, Mr. Chairman, in terms of a felony? Is there a threshold for major economic loss in the code?
Criminal damage to property in the second degree. What is it now? I think that it changed a year or two before I got here. What is it now, Ms. Travis? Yeah, 1,500 is and that's a felony version of damage to property.
And perhaps we could include that as well.
The Chairman Setzler has a question, and I was going to ask, I know Mr. Easton and the time that we've spent together offline on this, we had discussed kind of the concept in lines 59 through 69, which are the tiered sentencing. And what I wanted to ask, and I think that we talked about this in one of our meetings, but the range that's been assigned to critical infrastructure, 15 to 25, does that come from, is this modeled or similarly fashioned after federal code, and what was the range on that?
Sure, hold on just one moment. Right, so in the federal code, in 2332B that we were looking at, it uses for destroying or damaging any structure, conveyance, or other real or personal property by imprisonment for not more than 25 years. So the federal code has an upper bound on what the sentence can be, but it doesn't actually have a range, which we tend to use in Georgia. So 15 is just what we have in there at the moment.
We made it up.
Lower bound.
15, we just picked a number.
We literally
It can be lower if you want it.
I do it all the time. What I'm wrestling with here is, and we can talk about this later today, is, again, I'm very aware of the burden of the types of acts that have to be met on the first page, and I believe we've set a high burden even by removing, if that element of the ideology is removed, this is still a significant burden. But what I'm wrestling with is the way that this is structured. Is it the way I read line 70 is this would be a straight time sentence. So if the minimum that you would be, the judge would be allowed to sentence you to would be 15 years to serve per a violation of number 4. Is that y'all's interpretation?
That is.
And so what I'm wondering or wrestling with is, again, realizing and referencing our high burden of these types of acts, but are there ways that a person could be prosecuted under this part and receive a 15-year sentence for conduct that is, that would be more appropriately punished at 8 years to serve. Or I think you understand what I mean.
Right.
And
Yeah, if you think that, you're making the policy decision to lower the minimum. We're
Mhm.
basically giving a mandatory minimum of 15. You want that to be 1, 5, 10, pick your number, and we have the tiers for the different conduct. That's I don't have a vested interest in that. Literally, we made the numbers up trying to say what would be an appropriately serious punishment. We're tracking the feds a little bit to have the max.
Sure.
You know, but we
Mhm.
thought there ought to be a minimum. You know, I'm not vested that that it couldn't be partly probated. I'm
Mhm.
not vested that it has to be consecutive and couldn't be a concurrent sentence. If you feel differently in giving flexibility to the prosecutor or the judge
Or
in
the
the
judge.
sentencing,
Mhm.
then that's fair play, and that's just a policy choice. And I don't know what's the best, because
Mhm.
all of these offenses there would be a corresponding another criminal violation. You know.
Okay, Chairman Setzler.
Hey, Mr. Chairman, I'll address this to Mr. Eason, or the author. On lines 59 through 62, this is just again, this is a question I don't actually know the answer to this. Maybe it could be directed to counsel. Under current law for death penalty, can you get the death penalty in Georgia? Is it only for malice murder or felony murder? Can you get the death penalty for a felony murder, I guess? So if you're driving drunk and you kill somebody, okay. Well, let me back up. Let me find my proper fact pattern. Okay, help me on it. What's a good garden variety felony murder that's not a malice murder?
Armed robbery happens all the time.
Okay. So if you kill someone through that, then you can get the death penalty for it. It doesn't draw the distinction that you have to have gone through sort of this premeditated malice murder fact pattern to get the death penalty. Then that's current law. Is that correct?
That's right.
So understand, and that was my next question. So if you satisfy one of the aggravating circumstances, but it's in the context of a felony murder, not a malice murder, can you still get? And this is a technical question. Do we want to draw that distinction?
You're asking the right person.
Okay.
Jill.
And this is just a kind of a technical perfecting of this. If it's limited to malice murder for the death penalty, then do we want to mirror it here, or do we want to open?
We're mirroring right now.
Okay.
All right. One last question. I believe it's Representative Bodie, and then there's a couple of folks that have signed up to speak, and then I'll give the last word to the author of the bill, and then I think we'll convene or discuss where to go tomorrow for this. But Mr. Bodie?
The exact same protection for non-electronic records and electronic records, because I think that search warrant for me is the way to go. I think, as you stated earlier, it's due process. Person comes in, has to swear application, search warrant application to a magistrate court judge. If the judge say yay, you get your warrant. If the judge say no, you don't get your warrant. So I think it's clean, it's concise, so I would kind of like to do the same thing for non-electronic records as well.
Realistically, If you put it in somewhere between lines 119 and 130, probably be near 127 like you're saying, then you are changing that requirement not only for investigations of domestic terrorism, but also everything else already included. So you would more than likely want to create a new section to go in this bill. You know, kind of just strike what I got there from 119 to 130 and propose something that's specific to domestic terrorism if you feel like that's appropriate, because I think it's harder to change this bill, that section or section 3-4 below it without interfering with the existing structure and these other type of criminal acts. But you could do it, and that's kind of what I had done in my original version that passed the Senate. And I was tracking this kind of language in there, but it included additional statutory language as well. That would be my suggestion, and I suppose you would offer that as an amendment to this substitute and see what the will of the committee is if they concur with your concerns there.
Yes.
There were 4 people that signed up to speak that we didn't get to do that last time. Mr. Weaver's not here, so Miss Yagoub and Mr. Leader, if you want to stay there, they can come to the podium. It's totally up to you. And I'm going to limit you to 2 minutes. I apologize, but I'm about to pass out up here. It is now.
All right, thank you. I just want to bring up some of the comments that were addressed previously in the last 2 subcommittee hearings. I respectfully disagree with some of the comments made by Senator Jackson. He spoke and said that the NAACP and Black Lives Matter both support his amendment and this bill. I have had extensive conversations with both the Georgia NAACP and the Atlanta NAACP, and neither of them do support this bill. The representative that was present from Black Lives Matter does not actually speak for Black Lives Matter of Greater Atlanta, and so I just wanted to make that correction. I also wanted to point out some specific issues that I have with the bill. I just wanted to let you know what position I'm speaking from. I am the policy director for Asian Americans Advancing Justice in Atlanta. I was also one of the co-organizers of the Atlanta March for Social Justice and Women. We speak in this bill about lawful assemblies and lawful protests. I just want to bring up the argument that had the Atlanta March gone awry and had there been structural damage to Liberty Plaza, would myself and the 65,000 other people that marched that day, would we have been penalized with the charge of domestic terrorism? I'm just putting that out there as a hypothetical statement. As you know, nothing did go wrong that day, but I want you to be aware that there are people in this state and in this country that do have the right to resist policies and things that are happening in this country. And with our First Amendment rights, we will be protesting. And I just want to make it very clear that we feel that this is a threat to our First Amendment rights just because of the extended circumstances that can lead to a domestic terrorism charge.
You have 30 seconds.
Yeah, all right. I also wanted to mention something that has not been mentioned before. There is no due process associated with reporting of domestic terrorism by local law enforcement. I just wish that the committee can clarify what kinds of activities will be reported by local law enforcement as domestic terrorism charges. Thank you.
Thank you. And I mean, I think that I can probably say, you mentioned the protest in Liberty Plaza and the 65,000. If something had gone wrong, I think the answer to that question is that if a single person or a group of persons could be identified as committing illegal acts during that rose to the level, I mean, hypothetically, yes, but it would require the commission of acts by individuals. Senator Kauser, do you agree with my assessment of that? This creates a threshold with what I would call an extraordinarily high burden, one of the highest burdens I'm aware of. And so I think that if an individual actor could be identified as having done something that rose that level, then the answer would be yes. But would all 65,000 protesters or the group that organized the protest necessarily be captured under that? I would say no.
I would just respectfully say that we would like some clarification, because we do not want this to trample on our First Amendment rights. We do not want people to be scared to organize protests and to be scared to protest by civil disobedience, as Chairman Setzler mentioned in one of the committee hearings as well.
Okay, thank you so much for being here today. And then Mr. Bruce, is Mr. Bruce at the ACLU here? Okay, you got 2 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, Christopher Bruce, ACLU, I'm policy counsel here. I'm going to yield my time for the lady back here. I believe she was going on the right path.
I think that, I think that she
well, there are
is
other
there
things
anything that
we
you have to add
actually
to the conversation?
discussed as well, and she's the person I'd like to address these issues.
Is there a question for the ACLU? Okay, you actually have a question, so if you could stay at the...
Yes.
So this question is actually for either, but if the committee, in its judgment, were to make explicit that the terrorism statute, the definition of domestic terrorism required the violation of a felony, and so we excluded misdemeanor, would that satisfy your concerns?
And I'll talk to my colleague here, but I would say actually no. And the reason why I would say no is that the ACLU is against anything that prohibits free speech or any type of constitutionally protected speech. And I'd like to also point out that the amendment that's in there, we do not believe goes far enough to protect speech or protest. I do want to add, I do want to recognize that I see what the committee is trying to do as far as protecting Georgians, and I definitely respect the amount of time that has been put forth towards this. We just do not think that the bill goes far enough to protect protesters.
Well, and I say this very respectfully. I'm not sure what else it could do to go farther, based on the language that's been added in, and again, the enormous burden. I personally am not sure. And then, additionally, as discussed, if we explicitly added in felony conduct, everybody, I believe, is in this room is on the same page that you can't lawfully protest and commit felonies and hide under the shield of lawful protest. I don't think there's anybody in this room that would feel that that's an appropriate, legal, lawful way of exercising your right to protest. And so I really, truly think, this is, I'm a lawyer and I'm a former prosecutor, and so I think about stuff like this. I dream about this stuff in my sleep, unfortunately. I can tell you that it is, I believe it's drafted in such a way that, to me, answers that concern. And my question is that I would wonder, based on what's been added and what we see, is there hypothetically a level of satisfaction that you would ever have with this? And I wouldn't be sure how that could be achieved. Again, I'm not trying to speak for the author of the bill here, but I just understanding what we're looking at, I understand what y'all are saying, and I very much appreciate you being here, and I appreciate and respect your testimony. But I think if we look at as Chairman Setzler always says, we look at the words on the paper, and I look at the words on the paper, and I feel comfortable. Did you have something?
I want to appreciate your words. I want to challenge you that I do think this committee may offer some amendments.
Yes.
I wouldn't presuppose what those are going to be or what's going to be successful. I will challenge you, though, to consider that the word SB1 has gotten polarized in the political discussion for many good and maybe not so good reasons. But I'm going to challenge you that if this committee does act on this and sends it forward with favorable consideration with some amendments, consider the bold move of supporting it once it's amended. You don't know the words on the page we're talking about, but it will be difficult for your organizations to do that given the earlier polarization. But the gentleman, the Senate Majority Leader, is very open to this being crafted and perfected. I would just challenge you organizationally, although it would be difficult for you to do, consider supporting the gentleman's amended proposition, because we take your concern seriously. And what I've seen before, not to lecture, but I've seen before is this committee takes concerns on a bill that's been polarized, perfects many of those, and we still don't on the backside see an understanding of that, a thawing of the polarization that can bring support when perhaps support ought to come. So if this is fixed adequately, I would challenge you to consider supporting it.
Thank you, Chairman Setzler. And I'd like to also say thank you for pointing out some of the flaws that are in the bill. I want to say that ACLU is here to work with the committee and the legislature. So we are open. If a bill does come to our satisfaction, then we will do that. And I also want to point out that after the Muslim ban, we all know that there was a protest at the Atlanta Hartsfield Airport. Over 7,000 people came out within 24 hours. That was not a lawful protest. Under this, people would have been prosecuted because that was not a lawful protest. I personally called the airport. Go ahead, Chairman.
I had given everybody 2 minutes, and we've gone well beyond that. I know that some of it's been dialogue, but
Okay.
There's one last speaker, if she's here, Mary Hooks. Is Mary Hooks here today?
She's not.
Okay, she's not. Well, then I'm going to conclude the hearing, and we will convene. I'm not sure what time the hearing is set for tomorrow, but I believe it's in the afternoon. And Mr. Majority Leader, we can talk after the hearing. And Mr. Eason, thank you everybody for being here.